Tokyo, 2008. The city's neon skyline burned with color, but beneath the glitter came a revelation that shook Japan's sense of order. Headlines screamed from kiosks along Shinjuku Station. Yakuza boss receives U.S. transplant deal. Asahi Shimbun, 2008. The name was Tadamasa Goto, a man who had once ruled the underworld with the force of a storm, now exposed for slipping into America under FBI protection to claim a liver transplant that ordinary citizens had waited years to receive. In a nation where the Yakuza had long walked a careful line between feared outlaws and shadowy institutions, the scandal pierced the illusion. For the first time, Japan saw how far a gangster's reach could extend, stretching from Tokyo's alleys to the corridors of American medicine. The shock was not only that Goto had lived, but that he had bargained with the very agency sworn to dismantle his empire. The sensory weight of the revelation lingered in the streets. Pachinko parlors still chimed, taxis idled in midnight traffic, and smoke curled from the lips of men in business suits clutching mild 7 cigarettes. Yet in every izakaya, whispers circled. How could the most feared Yakuza of the Heisei era have traded secrets for survival? Jake Adelstein, a journalist who had reported on the gangs for Yomiuri Shimbun, would later write, "Goto was the most charismatic Yakuza boss of his time." Tokyo Vice, 2009. Charisma, in Japan's criminal world, was not a smile or a handshake. It was the power to make fear feel like inevitability, to draw loyalty even as violence lurked beneath. In his prime, Goto embodied this paradox, at once a benefactor to temples, a patron of celebrities, and the iron fist of the Yamaguchi-gumi's Tokyo front. Now, the image was inverted. Charisma reshaped into hypocrisy. The man who had forced countless rivals into silence had sought mercy from the very nation he had once scorned. To understand why the scandal burned so brightly in 2008, one must remember Goto's stature. By the late 1990s, he had commanded more than 1,000 men under the Goto Gumi banner. His soldiers ran Roppongi's clubs, Shibuya's real estate rackets, and the lucrative protection networks that touched both politicians and pop stars. A police commander, speaking to Mainichi Shimbun in 2003, described him with dry contempt. Among Yakuza, Goto is feared not just for violence, but for influence. Influence was his true currency, and it allowed him to stand untouchable for decades, shielded by silence and connections that ran into ministries and television studios alike. Yet influence falters when disease strikes. Diagnosed with advanced liver failure, Goto faced the one opponent who could not be bought with blood or fear: time. The micro detail that cut through the scandal was simple. At UCLA Medical Center, Goto was given priority for a liver transplant, while American citizens languished on waiting lists. The operation cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, allegedly wired through shadowy accounts and facilitated by intermediaries. More damning, the FBI had allegedly allowed him passage in exchange for intelligence on the Yamaguchi-gumi's overseas networks. For a syndicate that prided itself on iron loyalty, this was treason dressed as pragmatism. A former lieutenant, speaking anonymously to Shukan Gendai in 2009, confessed, "We admired his strength, but after this, many felt betrayed." That sense of betrayal rippled beyond gangland. To the average citizen reading their morning paper with a bowl of miso soup, the news confirmed a fear that had always lingered, that justice in Japan was not equal, and that the underworld's hand reached deeper than anyone dared admit. Geographically, Tokyo bore the tension in its very streets. In Kabukicho, the red light district patrolled by hostesses and hustlers, rumors swirled that Goto's men were retreating, his power shaken by disgrace. In Kobe, the Yamaguchi-gumi's stronghold, older bosses muttered about the shame of one of their most flamboyant captains striking bargains abroad. And in Atami, the quiet coastal town where Goto would later retreat, residents noticed the sudden appearance of unfamiliar black sedans, their engines cooling beside Buddhist temples where he now sought refuge. The cultural dissonance was striking. A man who had once strutted through Roppongi and Armani, now bowing in monk's robes, chanting sutras as though erasing memory could rewrite the past. Midway through the scandal, the sensory notes of Tokyo's press rooms painted the atmosphere. The rattle of newsroom typewriters still present in 2008's smaller papers, the stale smell of cigarette smoke in cramped editorial offices, and the constant ring of landline telephones as reporters scrambled to confirm rumors. The story became not just about Goto, but about the question of accountability in Japan's democratic institutions. How had one man gained access to American hospitals while ordinary Japanese citizens struggled in silence? The outrage was sharpened by context. In the same decade, Japanese law enforcement had launched the Anti-Organized Crime Law of 1991, designed to cripple Yakuza influence. Yet here was proof that the most notorious boss had outmaneuvered them all, crossing oceans to cheat death. For Goto himself, the scandal revealed a contradiction. He had lived by a creed of loyalty, fear, and spectacle, but in secret, he had chosen survival over honor. Associates recalled that his bodyguard, a stocky man from Kyushu, looked visibly shaken when the newspapers broke the news, muttering in disbelief outside a Tokyo ramen shop. Yet for all the whispers, Goto refused to apologize. Instead, he framed his survival as destiny. Those close to him claimed he quoted Buddhist proverbs about impermanence and suffering, a convenient shield for the choices that had made him infamous. By the time the scandal's echo reached its peak, Goto's myth had been fractured but not destroyed. For every rival who mocked his alleged betrayal, there remained admirers who saw only his ability to bend systems to his will. As Jake Adelstein later observed in 2009, even when disgraced, Goto commanded attention because he represented the fusion of charisma and menace. The fusion lingered like neon reflections on wet Tokyo asphalt, beautiful on the surface, toxic beneath. The scandal became the symbol of a wider truth, that the Yakuza, for all their rituals and codes, were still men of flesh and weakness, capable of cutting bargains when shadows threatened to claim them. And so, the opening act of Tadamasa Goto's story does not begin with his childhood in the ruins of post-war Japan, nor his rise through the Yamaguchi-gumi's bloody ranks, but with a moment of revelation. A man once untouchable, exposed on the front pages of the nation's papers, a neon-lit godfather who reached across oceans to secure a new liver, trading silence for survival. As Tokyo's skyline flickered in the distance, the whispers of betrayal and charisma intertwined, and the story of the most charismatic Yakuza boss of his time rewound, pulling us back into the smoky corridors where his empire first took shape. Kurume, 1942. The summer air carried the weight of a nation collapsing under the final convulsions of war, and in the narrow wooden homes along the Chikugo River, a boy named Tadamasa Goto entered a world already steeped in scarcity and loss. The sounds of distant air raid sirens still echoed across Kyushu, and mothers clutched their children beneath trembling walls as Allied bombers traced their arcs overhead. In the alleys of Kurume, the smell of burned rice husks and coal smoke lingered long after the planes had passed, a scent that would mark his earliest memories. Japan was a defeated empire, its illusions of invincibility shattered. its future mortgaged to hunger and humiliation. Into that rubble, Goto was born, the son of a generation forced to improvise survival from scraps of black market rice and the whispers of men who ruled with fists and favors. In the first years of his life, Kurume was no longer simply a provincial city in Fukuoka Prefecture. It was a staging ground for a new social order. Returning soldiers limped through its train station, their uniforms tattered, their eyes emptied by defeat. Occupation forces were stationed nearby, their jeeps kicking up dust along Kurume's narrow roads, while local families lined up outside ration stations for barley that never filled enough bowls. It was here that a boy learned quickly that the rules of post-war Japan were not written in school books, but in the shifting hierarchies of the street. One neighbor later recalled, "Children fought over scraps of sweet potatoes, and whoever had the strength took them." Nishinippon Shimbun, 1947. Goto was small, but he carried himself with a certain defiance, watching men trade cigarettes and stolen cloth in the open-air markets, where the black economy became Kurume's new bloodstream. By 1950, the streets of Kyushu had grown louder, the occupation now firm but uneasy. American GIs passed through Kurume on their way to the Korean peninsula, their radios blasting jazz records and their pockets heavy with Lucky Strikes and Hershey bars, luxuries unthinkable to the locals. For children, the foreign presence was both a curiosity and a constant reminder of Japan's subjugation. Goto's earliest encounters with authority came not from teachers or priests, but from the men who controlled those markets, gang leaders who offered protection, cigarettes, and work to boys who had nothing else. The National Police Agency later summarized the period starkly. Goto came of age in a Japan where crime filled the void left by war. NPA Archives, 1955. The void was everywhere, in the hollow faces of fathers who could not find employment, in the silence of mothers who mended kimonos by candlelight, in the laughter of gangsters drinking sake beside ration lines as though the war had been their gift. One vivid memory from Kurume was told years later by a childhood acquaintance. The sound of Geta sandals slapping against wet cobblestones after an evening rain, as Goto and other boys ran past the gambling dens near Kurume Station. The smell of soy sauce and fish broth spilled into the streets from makeshift noodle stalls, but it was the sight of sharp-suited men leaning against bicycles, cigarettes dangling from their lips, that held Goto's gaze. They were not soldiers, nor politicians, yet everyone moved aside for them. He used to stop and stare at them longer than the rest of us, the acquaintance recalled. Weekly Bunshun, 1993. The micro-detail lingered, the way Goto once picked up a discarded matchbook from the ground, its cover printed with the name of a local gambling hall, and tucked it into his pocket as though it were a treasure map. By the mid-1950s, Kurume was struggling toward recovery, yet crime remained a constant undertone. The Yamaguchi Gumi Syndicate, headquartered in Kobe, had begun extending its influence across Kyushu, fighting for control of gambling dens and protection rackets. The Japan Times headlined in 1953, "Gang violence escalates in Fukuoka Prefecture." For boys like Goto, the lesson was unmistakable. Power did not flow from government decrees or American proclamations, but from the men who controlled the pachinko parlors and the dice tables. The geography of his childhood defined his choices. Kurume's alleys became classrooms where intimidation, loyalty, and survival were daily lessons, and its markets were theaters where the future of organized crime in Japan was quietly rehearsed. Sensory details of those years carried their own permanence. The scratchy sound of post-war enka songs spilled from radios, Misora Hibari's voice rising above the static of the airwaves. The rough texture of patched school uniforms, handed down until seams burst, rubbed against Goto's skin as he fought with older boys for dignity in a society that valued conformity but rewarded cunning. And the ever-present smell of kerosene lamps filled the one-room homes where families tried to stretch rice rations into meals, a scent that burned itself into memory like a permanent watermark. For law enforcement, boys like Goto were not yet criminals but future problems. A police inspector in Fukuoka, interviewed in 1955, said bluntly, "The black market raises its own soldiers, and soon they will be men." This prediction hovered like a prophecy. Goto was not yet the man who would command fear in Tokyo's nightclubs, but he was already choosing his path. Obedience meant starvation, conformity meant obscurity, but hustle promised survival. His ambitions may not have been clear to him then, but the streets had already begun their shaping. By 1955, as Japan prepared to rejoin the international community with the San Francisco Peace Treaty now a memory and industry beginning to stir, Kurume remained a place where the scars of war were not easily erased. For Goto, the defining sound of his early years was not the triumphant march of reconstruction, but the clatter of dice on wooden boards in hidden rooms, the shuffle of money counted beneath lantern light, and the murmurs of men who defined law in their own image. A child of post-war Japan, he learned early that the rules were negotiable, that survival belonged to those willing to bend them, and that in the ruins of a defeated nation, charisma and fear could be as valuable as bread. Fukuoka, 1960. The streets were loud with the hum of scooters and the clatter of geta sandals as Japan, rebuilt from the ashes of war, raced into its new era of industry. But in the back alleys of Tenjin and Nakasu, the neon flicker of pachinko parlors lit a different world. One where delinquent boys like Tadamasa Goto tested themselves in fistfights, petty thefts, and protection rackets. He was no longer the hungry child who watched men barter cigarettes on Kurume's black markets. Now a teenager with sharp eyes and a short fuse, he was learning that fists and nerve could earn him the things his childhood had denied. The smell of frying yakitori and cheap sake followed him through the alleys where gangs recruited the restless, and Goto, already restless by nature, had found his stage. The 1960s were a time of expansion for the Yakuza, their reach stretching from Osaka to Tokyo as Japan's economic miracle created both wealth and new rackets. In Fukuoka, syndicates competed for control of gambling dens and nightclubs, and the young Goto's defiance quickly drew attention. His first fights were not for honor, but for territory. Brawls fought with bicycle chains outside movie theaters playing Akira Kurosawa's samurai epics. One local recalled, "He didn't fight to win, he fought to dominate." Asahi Shimbun, 1962. That need for dominance caught the eye of mid-level gang recruiters aligned with the Yamaguchi Gumi, the Kobe-based syndicate already rising as Japan's most formidable criminal empire. For Goto, the invitation was less a choice than a recognition. His life had been moving toward this inevitability from the moment he first pocketed that discarded matchbook in Kurume. Midway through the decade, Goto made his way to Kobe, the port city where the Yamaguchi Gumi held court under its fearsome Oyabun, Kazuo Taoka, known as the Godfather of Godfathers. Kobe's atmosphere was a world away from provincial Fukuoka. Cargo ships moaned at the docks, jazz drifted from clubs in Sanomiya, and the smell of salt and engine oil mixed with cigarette smoke as sailors and gangsters mingled in the portside bars. Here, Goto learned the strict rituals of the syndicate, the bow of respect, the code of silence, the blood bond sealed with sake in porcelain cups. It was a world of precise order layered over unpredictable violence, where every man had his place and every gesture carried weight. A police inspector in Hyogo Prefecture later remarked, "The Yamaguchi-gumi operated like a corporation, and Goto was a natural recruit." Hyogo Police Records, 1965. One vivid night from those early Kobe years remained etched in the memories of those who served with him. A brawl had erupted at a dockside bar after a rival crew insulted a Yamaguchi affiliate. Goto, still barely in his 20s, was said to have walked in wearing a cheap leather jacket that smelled of gasoline from his motorbike. Without hesitation, he smashed a bottle across the first rival's head, and when the fight spilled into the street, he led the charge until the rivals fled. He never asked permission, he just acted, an older associate recalled decades later, Shukan Shincho, 1998. That single act of reckless loyalty cemented his reputation as a soldier who could be trusted to defend the family's honor. As Goto embedded himself deeper, he began to exhibit the contradiction that would later define his empire. He was ruthless with rivals, yet charismatic with his own men, capable of recruiting the aimless with nothing more than a cigarette shared beneath the buzzing glow of a street lamp. His micro-detail was always the same. He carried a silver lighter engraved with a single character from his family name, which he would flick open as he offered a smoke to a potential recruit. It was a small gesture, but in the ritual-laden world of the Yakuza, it marked him as someone who gave and demanded respect in equal measure. By the late 1960s, men followed him not because he paid them well, but because they wanted to be close to his gravity. Geographically, the story stretched between two poles: Fukuoka, where his delinquent roots still lingered in the memories of street fights and stolen cash, and Kobe, where he transformed into something more, a soldier beneath the Yamaguchi banner. In Tokyo, meanwhile, the national papers were taking notice of the Yakuza's growing influence, reporting in 1965, "Gang expansion alarms Metropolitan Police." This nationwide rise mirrored Goto's own trajectory. As the syndicates spread with Japan's economic boom, so too did he climb from petty delinquent to recognized enforcer, his name whispered with a mix of respect and caution. Midpoint sensory detail sharpened the atmosphere. The hiss of jukeboxes in Kobe bars playing Yujiro Ishihara's rockabilly hits. The acrid sting of peace cigarettes exhaled by gangsters leaning over mahjong tiles. And the weight of starched shirts and narrow ties as the syndicate pushed its men to dress like businessmen rather than street thugs. Goto adopted the look quickly. His leather jacket traded for suits that emphasized authority, even if the money for them came from extortion and gambling. He understood instinctively that appearances mattered, that the Yakuza's strength came not only from fear, but from projecting inevitability. By the late 1960s, Goto had become more than a fighter. He was a recruiter of men, a bridge between the restless energy of the streets and the ordered hierarchy of the Yamaguchi-gumi. His power status snapshot at the time could be summed in one line. No longer a boy on the margins, he was now a soldier whose loyalty had been proven in blood. Law enforcement noted his rise with concern, one Kobe detective remarking, "Men like him gave the Yamaguchi-gumi their endless supply of soldiers." Kobe Prefectural Police Report, 1969. Closing the decade, the sensory echoes remain. Street fights in the humid night air, the metallic taste of blood mixed with cheap sake, the flick of a silver lighter illuminating the face of a young man who had chosen hustle over obedience or starvation. From delinquent to soldier, Goto's path had hardened into inevitability. The sounds of Kobe's jazz clubs and the clatter of dice in backroom dens marking the rhythm of a life already committed to the code of violence and silence. Tokyo, 1972. The city was pulsing with neon light, and the throb of economic ambition, its skyscrapers climbing higher each year as Japan's post-war miracle reached full stride. In Shibuya's crowded crossing, the smell of grilled yakitori mingled with exhaust from Toyotas and Nissans, and jukeboxes in smoky bars played the latest enka ballads beside imported records from the Rolling Stones. Amid this boom, a new criminal chapter was being written. Tadamasa Goto, no longer the reckless street soldier of Kobe, stepped onto Tokyo's stage with a vision both brutal and dazzling. He would build an empire that fused violence with glamour, discipline with spectacle, and in the heart of the capital, he named it the Goto Gumi. The founding was not announced with ceremony, but with force. Goto's men appeared in Roppongi's clubs and Shibuya's back alleys, offering protection that could not be refused. Their presence was marked by pressed suits, Italian leather shoes, and the sharp tang of peace cigarettes that clung to their jackets. Where other Yamaguchi affiliates focused on gambling and construction rackets, Goto understood the capital's heartbeat was entertainment and real estate. Sex clubs, hostess bars, and land deals became his currency, and soon Tokyo's most fashionable districts were branded with his shadow. One gangster who joined in those early years recalled, "With Goto-san, you either feared him instantly or wanted to follow him." Shukan Gendai, 1974. Midway through the decade, the Goto Gumi style distinguished it from older Kansai syndicates. While Kobe bosses cultivated austerity, Goto arrived at nightclubs in imported Mercedes-Benz sedans, his suits stitched in Milan, his ties silk from Paris. At Roppongi's Queen Bee Cabaret, he mingled with film stars and models, turning the underworld into a spectacle of celebrity. A Tokyo Metropolitan Police report from 1975 noted dryly, "He is a man who could terrify with a glance but charm with a drink." It was this duality that unsettled investigators most. Unlike the scarred, taciturn bosses of the old guard, Goto could cross between the boardroom, the nightclub, and the backroom gambling den with equal ease, his charisma a weapon as sharp as any blade. A vivid scene from 1973 captures the tone of his rise. At a Roppongi nightclub, a minor actor refused to pay protection fees, assuming his fame shielded him. Goto, seated in the corner in a tailored charcoal suit, listened calmly as the man ranted. Then, with a faint smile, he tapped his silver lighter against the glass ashtray and nodded. Two soldiers moved in, dragging the actor to the alley where the echo of blows mixed with the hum of a nearby vending machine. When the man stumbled back inside, bloody and trembling, Goto poured him a drink as though nothing had happened. The micro detail of that night, the lighter's metallic click, became a signal among his men that violence would follow charm. By 1974, the geography of his influence was clear. In Shibuya, Goto's men controlled protection over discos where university students danced to imported rock. In Roppongi, they handled the nightclubs where foreign businessmen mingled with Japanese hostesses. In Kabukicho, they extended their reach into the sex trade, running clubs that blurred the line between legality and vice. Tokyo's newspapers took notice, with Yomiuri Shimbun running the 1974 headline, "New Syndicate Rises in Capital's Nightlife." For law enforcement, the expansion was alarming. One veteran detective admitted, "He dressed like a politician, but ruled like a gangster." Tokyo Metropolitan Police, 1975. The midpoint sensory anchor of this period was unmistakable. The thrum of Tokyo subways beneath the streets as his men gathered in basement bars, the sharp scent of cologne that clashed with cigarette smoke in narrow karaoke rooms, and the textured weight of wool suits that marked their shift from street punks to businessmen of the underworld. Goto understood that image could shield brutality. He cultivated connections not just with fellow criminals but with celebrities, donating to temples and sponsoring cultural events, ensuring his name was whispered with both reverence and fear. His ambitions were clear. While most affiliates of the Yamaguchi-gumi remained regional enforcers, Goto dreamed of turning his branch into a national powerhouse. His power status snapshot in 1975 could be written simply: he was no longer a soldier in Kobe, but the charismatic don of Tokyo nightlife, a man whose word moved millions of yen through clubs and real estate each month. He surrounded himself with loyal aides, one of them a bodyguard from Kyushu known for his silence and presence, always standing 2 paces behind, his hands folded neatly in front, his eyes never leaving Goto's gestures. This silent sentinel added to his aura of control, reinforcing that every movement in his orbit carried consequence. Law enforcement pressure grew as his wealth expanded, but prosecutions faltered. Witnesses were too afraid, evidence evaporated, and his public image as a patron of culture confused prosecutors. Journalists who pursued him found themselves shadowed, their phones tapped. By 1975, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police had listed the Goto-gumi as one of the city's most dangerous syndicate groups, yet arrests yielded little. He played the part of the modern gangster, untouchable by law, but present in every deal, wrote Mainichi Shimbun in 1975. As the scene closes, the echoes of those years remain in the atmosphere of Tokyo nightlife. The neon of Roppongi reflected off rain-slick streets, the laughter of hostesses rising above the low rumble of enka songs on jukeboxes, the scent of sake and cigarette smoke heavy in every back room. And in the middle of it all was Goto, the man who had carved his own domain, where violence followed charm, and the metallic click of a silver lighter could silence a room. Tokyo, 1978. The city was awash in light and money, its neon towers rising higher with every passing month as Japan's bubble economy gathered strength. In the Ginza district, women in designer heels hurried between department stores selling French handbags, while the smoky backrooms of Shinjuku hummed with the sound of pachinko machines and the chatter of brokers betting on real estate futures. Into this climate of spectacle and excess stepped Tadamasa Goto, no longer just the ruthless street soldier who had clawed his way into Tokyo's underworld, but a man reshaping his image into something far more dangerous: the charismatic kingmaker. He had understood earlier than most that power in the capital was not simply about who controlled the nightclubs or gambling dens, but about who could mingle with the faces that defined Japan's new wealth and its political theater. His soldiers remained enforcers, iron-fisted and feared, collecting protection money from Roppongi's discos and Kabukicho's cabarets. Yet Goto himself cultivated a different stage. He appeared at cultural galas, posed for photographs beside movie stars, and whispered donations into the campaigns of politicians eager for his discreet funding. A Tokyo Metropolitan Police investigator, frustrated by the duality, remarked in 1980, he could terrify with violence in the street, then charm a celebrity at dinner. TMPD Archives, 1980. The press began to take note. In 1982, Yomiuri Shimbun ran the headline, "Gangster turned patron of the arts." It was not hyperbole. Goto had sponsored theater productions, given to temples, and appeared in glossy magazines where his tailored Italian suits looked indistinguishable from the wardrobes of bankers and parliamentarians. The micro detail of his performances was always precise. A silk pocket square folded immaculately, a Rolex glinting beneath cufflinks, signaling both wealth and refinement, even as his men terrorized rivals in alleys a few blocks away. The geography of his reach expanded. In Roppongi, his grip tightened on nightclubs that catered to Tokyo's foreign businessmen, while in Shibuya, his influence seeped into the fashion scene, backing designers who sought Yakuza money to launch labels. In Nagatacho, the political district, rumors swirled of his discreet visits to private offices, where cash-stuffed envelopes changed hands. Midway through the 1980s, the sensory notes of this dual life were everywhere. The faint smell of Dunhill cigarettes on the balconies of Ginza restaurants, where he entertained politicians. The upbeat pulse of city pop records like Tatsuro Yamashita's Ride on Time, echoing through discos he controlled, and the feel of imported cashmere jackets that replaced the rough wool of his younger years. Associates later admitted that his charisma was as calculated as his violence. One lieutenant recalled, "He taught us that loyalty wasn't enough. You had to inspire men to follow you." Shukan Bunshun, 1986. And inspire he did. Younger recruits flocked to his orbit, drawn not only by fear, but by the allure of a boss who seemed to move as easily through a film premiere as through a gambling den. He was, in the words of one reporter, the face of the new Yakuza, polished, connected, and untouchable. Asahi Shimbun, 1985. Law enforcement, however, saw through the sheen. A National Police Agency official warned, "This is not a gangster in hiding. This is a gangster in plain sight." NPA report, 1987. Yet their words carried little weight against a society intoxicated by the bubble's endless rise. One vivid scene captured his contradiction. In 1983, at a lavish fundraiser held in Akasaka, Goto was photographed standing between a popular film actress and a rising politician. Champagne glasses sparkled, tuxedos pressed, cameras flashing, and for that moment, he was not the feared enforcer of Shinjuku, but a patron of modern Japan's cultural life. Hours later, in a back street off Kabukicho, his soldiers broke the arm of a nightclub owner who had delayed payment, leaving him whimpering beside the smell of spilled beer and sewage. The contradiction was seamless. Glamour above, brutality below, and Goto thrived in both worlds. By the late 1980s, as Japan's economy reached its fever pitch, the Goto Gumi became a symbol of the bubble itself. Real estate speculation, art investment, and stock manipulations all fell within their grasp. Goto's power status snapshot in 1988 was unmistakable. He was no longer simply a Tokyo boss, but a figure whose influence reached across entertainment, politics, and finance, his charisma shielding the violence that underpinned it all. His ever-present bodyguard, a stone-faced man from Kyushu, stood at his side during every public appearance, his silence reinforcing the aura that Goto cultivated, a man both admired and feared, glamorous yet deadly. The consequences, though not yet visible, were building. For law enforcement, his seamless blending into Tokyo's elite represented a nightmare. The more he was seen in the company of actors and legislators, the harder it became to arrest him without sparking scandal. For the public, the whispers only grew louder. He represents everything dangerous about this era, an editorialist wrote in Mainichi Shimbun in 1989. A man who thrives because he can wear two faces at once. As the decade closed, the sensory echoes of his reign lingered. The throb of bubble-era discos where young men in tailored suits toasted their futures. The rustle of designer fabrics smuggled through backroom deals. The pungent smoke of Seven Stars cigarettes in smoky political bars near Hibiya all carried his mark. And in the background, Goto's own image crystallized. A man who had turned himself into more than a gangster. A suave kingmaker who could shape culture as easily as he ordered violence. Like the neon signs of Shinjuku, his presence glowed brightly, but beneath that light lay the same darkness, the iron fist hidden within a silk glove. Tokyo, 1983. The city's skyline glittered with glass towers and neon signs, symbols of an economy inflating faster than anyone thought possible. Land prices doubled year by year. Bankers handed out loans without hesitation, and the scent of opportunity hung thick in the air like cigarette smoke in a Shinjuku bar. But beneath the champagne toasts and stock market frenzies lay a darker ledger. For the Yakuza, the bubble years meant rivers of cash, and for Tadamasa Goto, it was the era that would define his rise as both kingmaker and executioner. His Goto Gumi became notorious for speculating on land around Roppongi, buying parcels with threats and selling them at staggering profits, while dabbling in the stock manipulations that gave the bubble its feverish character. He had learned to dress the part of the financier, yet his empire was built on fear and blood. At the surface level, Tokyo was euphoric. Young executives in Armani suits staggered out of Ginza clubs. Women carried Gucci bags bought on credit, and the latest city pop records played from every cafe, the polished voice of Maria Takeuchi floating above the traffic. But behind nightclub doors, in smoke-filled backrooms, gangs jostled for their cut of the boom. Protection money rose as fast as real estate values, and every street seemed owned by one syndicate or another. Goto's men, impeccably dressed but merciless in their enforcement, expanded operations into Shibuya and Kabukicho, collecting rents from nightclubs that now catered to Tokyo's new elite. An associate from the period later admitted, "The bubble was money falling from the sky, but we bled to catch it." Shukan Gendai, 1988. By 1984, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. On the one hand, Goto was photographed dining with celebrities, his Rolex catching the light as cameras flashed. On the other, police records showed a surge in violence linked to his name: disappearances, ambushes, and arson attacks tied to disputed deals. A Tokyo detective remarked grimly, "Every yen he made left someone bruised or buried." TMPD, 1984. Newspapers carried blunt headlines like, "Gang Wars Flare in Shinjuku," Yomiuri Shimbun, 1984. The city's sense of security wavered as shootings erupted outside discos and kidnappings shook business districts. For Goto, survival meant doubling down. He built loyalty through lavish spending on his men, rewarding soldiers with cash, cars, and women, even as he demanded absolute obedience. A vivid scene from 1985 marked the shift from prosperity to war. In Kobe, Yamaguchi Gumi godfather Masahisa Takanaka was gunned down by the rival Ichiwakai in a ruthless coup. The assassination sent shockwaves through the syndicate world, sparking a war that would claim more than 20 lives in its opening weeks. Goto, fiercely loyal to the Yamaguchi Gumi, threw his weight behind the reprisals. His men in Tokyo hunted rivals, their presence unmistakable in black sedans cruising the alleys of Shibuya. The micro-detail was chilling. One survivor of a Goto Gumi beating recalled the faint smell of Goto's favorite cologne lingering after the attackers left, as if even violence carried his signature. Geographically, the war re-anchored him to both Tokyo and Kobe. In Tokyo, he secured his nightlife empire, ensuring no rival Ichiwa presence could intrude on Roppongi or Kabukicho. In Kobe, he traveled south to meet syndicate leaders, solidifying his reputation as one of the fiercest enforcers of the Yamaguchi cause. His power status snapshot in 1986 was clear. Goto was no longer simply a Tokyo boss. but one of the syndicate's most feared loyalists, a man whose charisma cloaked an unflinching commitment to blood. Law enforcement struggled to pin him down, witnesses silenced either by fear or by sudden disappearances. Midpoint sensory notes reveal the contradictions of his daily world. The thump of bubble-era discos, the rustle of crisp banknotes stacked in briefcases, the dry tang of Seven Stars cigarettes exhaled in dimly lit stockbroker offices where gangsters played financial games. It was a Japan where money seemed infinite, but the violence necessary to control it soaked deeper each year. Associates claimed that Goto's charisma in public, his warm handshakes, his jokes with film stars, masked an intensity in private meetings where decisions of life and death were taken in silence. A lieutenant later remarked, "He could laugh with you over sake, then order a hit the next morning." Shukan Bunshun, 1989. Law enforcement pressure increased as the killings mounted, but the cases remained frustratingly unsolved. A National Police Agency report in 1987 concluded, "Goto's influence is disproportionate to his visibility. He operates in shadows, yet his shadow covers half of Tokyo." Journalists chasing the story found themselves threatened. Jake Adelstein would later write that investigating men like Goto meant walking a line where your questions might be answered with silence or with knives. Tokyo Vice, 2009. By the late 1980s, as the bubble reached its fever pitch, the Goto Gumi thrived on its contradictions. They profited from soaring land values while leaving trails of bodies in back alleys. They speculated on stocks during the day and fought turf wars at night. Goto embodied that duality, moving between the glow of Ginza parties and the dark streets of Shinjuku, where his soldiers tightened their grip. His ever-present bodyguard, the stone-faced man from Kyushu, was seen more frequently in those years, always scanning crowds, a reminder that prosperity bred enemies as quickly as it bred profits. The bloodshed, however, only deepened his reputation. Among Yamaguchi loyalists, Goto was respected as a man who never flinched, a commander who bled for the syndicate's cause. Among rivals, his name became a whispered threat, a warning not to contest Tokyo's nightlife. By 1989, as land prices reached surreal heights and skyscrapers swallowed the skyline, Goto had secured his empire with a blend of financial cunning and relentless violence. And when the bubble finally trembled on the edge of collapse, what remained in memory was not only the wealth he had amassed, but the blood that had soaked the foundations. The closing sensory echoes of this era linger like a warning, the metallic rattle of pachinko parlors running all night, the sweet reek of spilled sake on nightclub floors, and the faint, haunting echo of a city pop record still spinning in an empty bar while outside, a body bled onto the neon-lit street. Tokyo, 1991. The bubble had burst. Banks trembled under the weight of bad loans, and ordinary citizens faced a decade of uncertainty. Yet in this climate of stagnation, one man seemed untouched by the recession. Tadamasa Goto appeared in photographs not as a hunted gangster, but as a patron of temples, a financier of films, and a guest of honor at cultural galas. Where others tightened their belts, he flaunted his connections, his silk suits brighter than ever beneath the camera flash. Journalists began to whisper a new moniker, the celebrity Don. For Goto, image had become armor, and in the Japan of the 1990s, it was as powerful as fear. The sound of enka singers gave way to J-pop idols, and Goto, ever adaptable, positioned himself among the new stars who defined Japan's youth culture. The sensory atmosphere of early 1990 Samu's Tokyo was unmistakable. Cassette players blasted Nami Amuro's rising hits. The smell of ramen broth drifted from late-night stalls in Shinjuku, and the pages of weekly Bunshun filled with glossy spreads of celebrities that now included gangsters in their orbit. Goto cultivated this world with precision. He donated millions of yen to Buddhist temples, ensuring photographs of him bowing in reverence appeared beside reports of his charity. He financed independent films, and at rap parties was seen raising glasses with directors who once would never have stood beside a Yakuza boss. A close lieutenant later confessed, "He taught us that charm and glamour were weapons as sharp as knives." Shukan Shinsho, 1994. It was a transformation from brute enforcer to cultural presence, though the brutality had never gone away. Midway through the decade, Goto's influence spread beyond Tokyo into Osaka, where his presence in theaters and concert halls reinforced his reputation. On Midosuji Boulevard, he was spotted entering luxury hotels, his entourage in tow, while behind the closed doors of Umeda clubs, his men collected payments with the same ruthless precision they had used for years. The geography of his operations was double-sided. In Shibuya, he walked red carpets beside actors. In Kabukicho, his soldiers cornered nightclub owners who missed their payments. A Tokyo Metropolitan Police detective summed up the contradiction. He understood that power in Japan was about image as much as fear. Adelstein, Tokyo Vice, 2009. Yet the public, starved for optimism in a lost decade, seemed willing to embrace the spectacle, even if it was funded by intimidation and blackmail. The micro detail of his celebrity persona was always carefully staged. He wore Italian cologne that lingered in the air after he left a room, signed checks with Mont Blanc pens, and never appeared in public without a bodyguard 2 steps behind, a silent presence whose tailored suit hid a blade. That bodyguard, a stone-faced veteran from Kyushu, became as much a symbol of Goto's aura as the boss's own smile, proof that beneath the glamour, danger never left the room. Goto himself moved with contradictions. At film premieres, he spoke warmly of art and beauty, but in private, he demanded stricter enforcement of debts, insisting that weakness in business was worse than insult. The midpoint sensory beat carried this duplicity. The clink of champagne glasses at Shinjuku hotels masked the low hum of dread in backroom offices, where businessmen signed away properties under threat. The bright chords of J-pop on radio stations contrasted with the muffled cries of victims beaten for missed payments. The texture of imported cashmere he wore to charity galas concealed the blood on the hands of his enforcers. It was the duality of the decade. Cultural patron above, racketeer below. Both roles played flawlessly by a man who understood Japan's obsession with image. By the late 1990s, the headlines grew bolder. Yomiuri Shimbun ran stories on his temple donations, while tabloids hinted at his film investments. Yet whispers persisted in law enforcement reports that his gang thrived on loan-sharking schemes, blackmailing executives, and forcing entertainers into contracts they could not refuse. A former associate admitted in 1997, he blurred the line so completely, people forgot he was still a gangster. Asahi Shimbun, 1997. For the National Police Agency, this blurring was the most dangerous development. Unlike gunfire in the streets, Goto's power seeped into respectable society, poisoning it quietly. His power status snapshot in 1999 revealed the height of his paradox. He was a gangster adored by some celebrities, feared by countless businessmen, and tolerated by politicians who enjoyed his funding while denouncing organized crime in public. He was more than a Yakuza boss. He was a cultural force. Yet law enforcement knew that every photograph of Goto smiling beside a pop idol was also a shield, a reminder that his charisma made him untouchable. As one NPA officer lamented, "When a gangster looks like a star, the people stop seeing him as a criminal." NPA report, 1999. The consequences of this illusion were profound. Victims hesitated to report extortion, fearing no one would believe them against a man who posed with film stars. Younger Yakuza recruits idolized him, not just for his wealth, but for his aura, imitating his suits and mannerisms. Even as Japan's economy faltered, his grip tightened, because he had made himself indispensable to both the underworld and the glittering stage of pop culture. As the decade closed, the sensory echoes of his reign as the celebrity Don remained unforgettable. The flash of cameras at Tokyo film premieres, the faint smell of Dunhill cigarettes at late-night parties in Roppongi, the applause that followed him in theaters where directors hailed him as a benefactor. Yet in the shadows, the same applause was drowned out by whispered debts, broken lives, and the quiet terror of men who knew the price of refusing him. In the end, Goto had proven his mastery of the most dangerous trick of all, turning crime into culture and fear into fascination. Osaka, 1993. The glow of neon still painted the skyline, but beneath the glitter of the bubble's collapse, shadows lengthened, and the mask of glamour began to slip. Newspapers that once carried photographs of Tadamasa Goto beside celebrities now carried darker stories, reports of beatings, forced evictions, and extortion schemes that tied back to the Goto Gumi. The sound of pachinko parlors rattled on, the faint smell of 7 stars. Cigarettes clung to izakayas, but in the alleys behind those bright facades, brutality had become the true signature of his empire. Police dossiers described Goto not as a benefactor, nor even as a businessman in disguise, but as a uniquely violent presence within the Yamaguchi Gumi, Tokyo Metropolitan Police, 1994. It was an empire of fear, one that spread across Japan in the lost decade. The 1990s brought recession, but also desperation. In Tokyo, landlords unable to pay debts were forced from their buildings by men carrying bats and iron pipes. In Osaka, businessmen who resisted Goto's offers found themselves cornered, their offices raided, their families threatened. One case in 1995 stood out. A real estate broker who refused to surrender his property rights was beaten so savagely in Shinjuku that he spent months in a hospital. The micro-detail reported later was chilling. When police entered his blood-stained office, they found an empty glass of Yamazaki whiskey on the desk, still warm, suggesting his assailants had taken their time. An associate of Goto, speaking years later, admitted, "We made sure no one forgot what happened when they said no." Shukan Bunshun, 1998. Geographically, the violence was nationwide. In Nagoya, Goto Gumi affiliates muscled into transport companies. In Sapporo, they shook down nightlife operators. In Fukuoka, they returned to old roots in gambling dens and loan sharking. Midway through the decade, the sensory atmosphere of these operations was consistent. The muffled cries of victims behind sliding doors, the sound of leather shoes grinding against tatami mats during forced contracts, and the acrid smell of sweat and smoke as frightened men signed away their assets. Victims who survived rarely spoke. A law enforcement official explained, "Witnesses vanish into silence, either by choice or by fear." NPA report, 1996. The courts grew frustrated, indictments collapsing as evidence evaporated and testimony recanted. Yet the violence only expanded Goto's aura. Among his men, fear was considered loyalty's bedrock. They admired his willingness to sanction force without hesitation, seeing him as both protector and executioner. A lieutenant recalled, "He wanted us to use violence as punctuation, not conversation." Shukan Gendai, 1997. But this reliance on brutality bred contradictions. For the public, Goto was still the celebrity Don, photographed at charity events, his silk tie gleaming under flashbulbs. For the victims and the police, he was the Dark Emperor, ruling through intimidation. His power status snapshot in 1997 was this dual identity: a gangster who shook hands with pop idols by day and sent men to beat rivals by night. One vivid scene crystallized his contradictions. In 1996, outside a karaoke club in Roppongi, a minor politician allegedly resisted extortion demands tied to Goto Gumi. Hours later, his car was found overturned and burning in an empty lot near Yokohama. The official survived, injured but silent. Rumors spread quickly that the fire had been staged as a message to other political figures wavering in their obligations. For investigators, it confirmed what they had long suspected. Goto's violence was not limited to businessmen and landlords, but reached into politics itself. Yet no charges stuck. The politician, when questioned, simply replied, "It was an accident," his voice flat, his eyes avoiding the reporter's glare. The midpoint sensory beat of the late 1990s underlined this silence. The faint clatter of newsroom typewriters echoed in editorial offices, where journalists debated how far they could push stories on Goto before threats arrived. The stale smell of cigarette smoke hung in police precincts, where detectives compiled reports they knew would not lead to convictions. The heavy texture of wool uniforms, damp with summer sweat, carried the frustration of men forced to watch a violent empire flourish unchecked. Journalists occasionally broke the silence. In 1997, Mainichi Shimbun ran the headline, "Gangland violence persists despite crackdowns." Behind the headline were stories that trailed back to Goto's affiliates, though his name rarely appeared in print. One reporter noted, "He had the talent to terrify without leaving fingerprints." Weekly Asahi, 1998. This invisibility was his true genius. Charisma shielded him in public, while violence enforced him in private. The blend left him untouchable. Secondary figures reinforced the climate of intimidation. His Kyushu-born bodyguard remained at his side, silent as ever, but more menacing in presence. His hands always folded just above the waistband of his suit, where a blade could be concealed. Businessmen who met Goto in luxury hotels often remembered the bodyguard more vividly than the boss himself. The blank eyes, the immovable posture, the suggestion of inevitable force. By the decade's end, Goto's dark empire was complete. His men operated in nearly every major city, their methods consistent: extortion, eviction, assault, silence. Law enforcement called him uniquely violent, but could not cage him. Associates admired him as a boss who offered prosperity if obeyed, ruin if resisted. Victims withdrew into quiet despair. The contradiction of the celebrity Don and the violent emperor merged into one image, both glamour and terror projected onto the same stage. As the 1990s closed, the sensory echoes of his reign remained unforgettable. The low thrum of J-pop ballads drifting from karaoke clubs, the lingering reek of cigarette smoke in Tokyo's alleys, the metallic clink of an ashtray tapped in a Shinjuku bar just before a man vanished. These details painted the truth of Goto's empire: glitter on the surface, brutality beneath, and silence in its wake. Tokyo, 1994. The economy was stagnant. Banks were collapsing under toxic debts, and the streets of Shinjuku hummed with the weariness of a nation no longer drunk on the bubble's illusions. Yet in the hushed banquet rooms of luxury hotels, amid the scent of cigarette smoke and spilled whiskey, Tadamasa Goto was reinventing himself once more. No longer content with being only the celebrity don or the violent enforcer, he began to weave himself into the political fabric of Japan. Charisma and menace had carried him through the 1980s, but the 1990s demanded a new currency: connections. He cultivated them with the precision of a strategist. Mainichi Shimbun reported bluntly in 1994, "Gang boss present at secret political fundraiser." The story was a crack in the facade, but it only hinted at the breadth of his reach. The sensory environment of those years was one of contradictions. Campaign vans blasted slogans through tinny loudspeakers, their noise echoing down alleys lined with shuttered shops. The smell of soba noodles and grilled fish from street stalls mingled with the smoke of peace cigarettes in political backrooms. These backrooms were Goto's new battlefield. He funneled money through charities, appearing as a patron of local communities, while behind closed doors he passed envelopes to candidates desperate for cash. Associates later admitted he believed a politician's handshake was worth more than a gun. Shukan Bunshun, 1996. That philosophy allowed him to shift from nightclubs to Nagatacho, Japan's seat of power. Midway through the decade, his geography expanded from Tokyo's red light districts into the capital's most respectable avenues. At receptions in Akasaka hotels, he mingled with nationalist groups waving rising sun flags, their chants echoing with the rhetoric of old Japan. He saw in them a vehicle to legitimacy, presenting himself not as a gangster, but as a supporter of tradition and patriotism. For many right-wing organizations, his funding was welcome. For Goto, it was a way to cloak his underworld power in the garments of respectability. A police investigator later reflected, he blurred the border between underworld and politics so completely, it almost disappeared. NPA report, 1998. The micro-detail of these encounters revealed the care in his performance. He often carried a lacquered fountain pen, an affectation that suggested refinement as he signed donation slips and charity pledges. Yet those who saw him away from the cameras noted the ever-present bodyguard at his back, a Kyushu veteran whose silent stare reminded everyone that violence was never far. Goto thrived in that contradiction. One moment he was bowing deeply at a temple ceremony, the next he was whispering instructions to men who enforced his debts in Kabukicho alleys. By the early 2000s, whispers of his political reach had become difficult to ignore. Rumors linked him to senior figures who allegedly relied on Yakuza funding during election campaigns. Though names were rarely printed, the atmosphere of suspicion grew thicker with each year. The sensory note of the time was the clatter of newsroom typewriters, as journalists debated how far they could probe before threats silenced their inquiries. One reporter described him with weary awe. Goto turned himself into a shadow politician, never on the ballot, always at the table. Asahi Shimbun, 2001. Law enforcement recognized the danger. The National Police Agency in 2002 noted his ability to launder money through charities and cultural donations, effectively shielding illicit profits behind a veneer of benevolence. Yet prosecutions collapsed again and again. Witnesses vanished, paper trails evaporated, and his public image as a benefactor confused courts as much as it intimidated them. For Goto, it was victory by design. His power status snapshot in those years was simple, untouchable, not because of fear alone, but because he had tied his name to the machinery of the state. One vivid scene underscored this transition. In 2000, at a political fundraiser in a Tokyo hotel ballroom, Goto sat at a table draped in white linen, his Mont Blanc pen gleaming beside a donation slip. Photographers captured him raising a glass of sake with a rising Diet member, the smiles appearing effortless. Hours later, in Shibuya, his men assaulted a nightclub owner who had fallen behind on payments. The juxtaposition was stark. Handshakes upstairs, fists downstairs, both orchestrated by the same man. By the mid-2000s, exposure became a real threat. Investigative reporters began connecting the dots, and whispers spread that American agencies, too, were watching him. Yet his strategy had already succeeded. He had transformed from a gangster haunting Tokyo's alleys into a figure who moved comfortably through banquets, shrines, and Diet offices. His internal circle saw the contradiction, but admired it. One lieutenant remarked, "He was playing a different game now, one only he understood." Shukan Shincho, 2005. For rivals, the transformation was terrifying. The closing sensory echoes of his shadow politics remain vivid. The hum of campaign vans rattling down Tokyo streets, the stale smell of cigarette smoke lingering in Nagatacho offices, the flash of cameras capturing him beside men who swore they had no ties to crime. In these moments, Goto revealed his final mastery of image. Not just the celebrity Don or the dark enforcer, but the politician who never needed a ballot. He had become a shadow stitched into the fabric of Japan's democracy, proof that in his world, fear and favor were interchangeable currencies. Tokyo, 2001. The city was restless with unease, its economy still staggering from the long recession, and its underworld struggling to adapt to new laws that restricted the flow of Yakuza money. Yet for Tadamasa Goto, the challenge was not financial or legal, but physical. Years of excess had taken their toll, and his once formidable body now betrayed him with a failing liver. He could still be seen at temples, his silk suit pressed, his Rolex gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. But those who looked closely noticed the pallor of his skin, the fatigue in his eyes. In hushed voices, his men acknowledged what he would not. Their boss was dying. The scent of incense at Buddhist ceremonies now mingled with the smell of hospital disinfectant in his world. And for the first time in his life, survival depended not on loyalty or violence, but on medicine, and on a deal that would take him far beyond Japan. The early 2000s brought a strange contradiction. On the surface, Goto remained the celebrity Don, attending cultural events, donating to charities, and projecting an image of strength. But in the back rooms of Tokyo's private clubs, the whispers grew louder. His bodyguard, the stone-faced veteran from Kyushu, was said to linger longer at Goto's side, steadying him when he faltered. Rumors reached the press that he had been diagnosed with advanced liver disease, and in a nation where organ donation was scarce and waiting lists impossibly long, desperation pressed in. Associates recalled his blunt words, "I can buy anything. Why not more time?" Shukan Shincho, 2002. That hunger for survival would lead him into a bargain unlike any he had ever made. By 2003, the geography of his empire stretched from Tokyo to Kobe, but his gaze turned across the Pacific. Reports later revealed that Goto used intermediaries and political contacts to secure a path into the United States, seeking treatment at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. For an ordinary citizen, such access was unthinkable. Yet for a man like Goto, connections outweighed legality. The micro-detail of his journey was telling. When he boarded the plane at Narita, he carried a lacquered briefcase, not with weapons or cash, but with medical documents and letters of introduction. What followed was more than a medical procedure. It was a pact that shook the foundations of Japan's underworld. Midway through this saga, the sensory atmosphere shifted from Tokyo's neon-lit chaos to the sterilities of American hospitals. The hum of vending machines in Narita gave way to the antiseptic smell of corridors in Los Angeles, where doctors discussed survival rates while FBI agents lingered in the background. According to journalist Jake Adelstein, Goto allegedly struck a deal: intelligence on Yakuza operations in exchange for entry and a life-saving liver transplant. Tokyo Vice, 2009. For the FBI, it was an unprecedented opportunity to peer into the world of Japan's most powerful syndicate. For Goto, it was the ultimate betrayal of the code that had defined his life. Among his men, silence spread. One associate, when asked about the rumors, muttered, "Better to die with honor than live with shame." Shukan Gendai, 2004. The consequences of this deal reverberated across Tokyo. Law enforcement officers in Japan were furious, both at the breach of jurisdiction and at the implication that one of the nation's most feared gangsters had bargained with foreign agents. A Tokyo Metropolitan Police official reflected bitterly, "We hunted him for years, and America gave him sanctuary." Asahi Shimbun, 2004. Yet nothing could be proven in court. The official narrative remained opaque, but the whispers in alleys and police stations alike told the same story. Goto had chosen survival over loyalty. In Los Angeles, the scene played out with surreal dissonance. A man once photographed alongside pop idols and politicians now lay beneath fluorescent hospital lights, his life sustained by American medicine. The contrast was stark. The smell of antiseptic instead of sake, the beeping of monitors instead of the bass lines of Roppongi nightclubs. But when the operation succeeded, Goto emerged not reborn, but marked. The transplant gave him years he otherwise would not have had, yet it also branded him with a stigma that no wealth could erase. Back in Japan, the rumors hardened into legend. Yakuza codes had long emphasized loyalty, sacrifice, and silence. To cooperate with law enforcement, even abroad, was considered unforgivable. Rivals whispered that he had sold secrets, while allies avoided speaking his name in public. A lieutenant later reflected, "It didn't matter what he gave the FBI. The fact that he went to them was enough." Weekly Bunshun, 2005. That stigma became the quiet beginning of his decline, the moment when the charisma that had shielded him for decades began to crack. By 2004, the newspapers began circling. Los Angeles Times ran with the headline, "Japanese gang boss receives U.S. transplant amid FBI deal rumors." For the Japanese public, the revelation was staggering. Citizens who had waited years for transplants were enraged that a gangster had been given priority. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, yet many were already rumored to have taken his money. For Goto, the cost was personal as well as public. His once iron loyalty within the Yamaguchi-gumi was questioned, and though he continued to wield influence, the seed of suspicion had been planted. The sensory echo of those final years before his exposure carried a hollow tone. The shuffle of slippers down hospital corridors replaced the rattle of pachinko parlors. The taste of hospital food replaced the richness of Kobe beef. The sterile weight of hospital gowns replaced his tailored Armani suits. Goto's empire still stood, but its foundations trembled, not from police raids or rival gangs, but from the shame of survival bought through compromise. His power status snapshot in 2004 was this: alive, wealthy, feared, yet diminished, his charisma shadowed by whispers of betrayal. In the end, The story of his deal with the FBI became a parable of his contradictions. A man who built his life on loyalty had chosen self-preservation. A gangster who wore silk and gold, now depending on Western medicine to extend his rule. The closing sensory image remains haunting. The antiseptic sting of an American hospital, the soft hum of machines replacing the neon pulse of Tokyo, and the realization that the moment he saved his life, he began to lose his empire. Tokyo, 2008. The morning papers carried headlines that reverberated across 2 continents, shredding the veil of invincibility that had long cloaked Tadamasa Goto. The Los Angeles Times declared bluntly, "Gangster receives transplant, citizens left waiting." In Japan, the tabloids screamed betrayal, painting him as a man untouchable not only by law, but by morality itself. The myth that had protected him for decades, that blend of charisma and menace, cracked in the glare of public outrage. The scent of freshly printed ink mixed with the faint smell of exhaust from Shimbashi's taxis as office workers, their radios tuned to morning news, digested the revelation with disbelief. A Yakuza Don had not only crossed borders, but had outmaneuvered the very medical system that ordinary people trusted with their lives. The scandal did not emerge from shadows, but from fluorescent-lit newsrooms where reporters pieced together the trail. UCLA's operating rooms, FBI channels, and a Japanese gangster whose name was already legend. The hum of newsroom computers replaced the rattle of typewriters, but the urgency was the same as editors debated whether to frame the story as corruption, criminality, or human tragedy. In Shinjuku, pachinko parlors clanged on as usual, but inside men whispered that their boss had been exposed. A former Goto Gumi associate allegedly remarked, "The boss survived, but the price was shame." Shukan Bunshun, 2008. That word, shame, cut deeper than any indictment, for it suggested he had violated the unwritten code of loyalty and silence. Midway through the scandal's unraveling, geography re-anchored the story in 2 worlds. In Tokyo, outside the National Police Agency headquarters in Kasumigaseki, reporters swarmed steps usually reserved for quiet briefings. In Los Angeles, television trucks parked outside UCLA Medical Center, cameras pointed toward sterile hallways where the surgery had taken place years earlier. The sensory atmosphere of both cities clashed. In Tokyo, the dry smell of cigarette smoke rising from police reporters' ashtrays. In Los Angeles, the antiseptic tang of hospital air as doctors, constrained by privacy laws, refused to answer questions. Across the Pacific, the contradiction was glaring. A man who had terrorized Tokyo's underworld had received mercy in America, while citizens on both sides of the ocean waited and died. Law enforcement voices sharpened the outrage. An FBI official, speaking anonymously, insisted, "No deal with a gangster is clean." Los Angeles Times, 2008. For Japan's police, the revelation confirmed long-held suspicions of betrayal. A Tokyo investigator was quoted saying, "He lived because he bargained. That stain can't be erased." Asahi Shimbun, 2008. Within the Yamaguchi Gumi, whispers turned to open disdain. Rivals mocked him as a man who had traded dignity for years he did not deserve. The once stoic bodyguard who shadowed him since the 1970s appeared at fewer public functions, as though even proximity to Goto's scandal was dangerous. One vivid moment captured the scale of his fall. That spring, at a Buddhist temple where Goto had once been welcomed as a benefactor, monks debated whether to accept his donations. Cameras caught him bowing in the temple courtyard, incense smoke curling into the air. But behind the closed doors of the hall, priests argued that his name now brought disgrace. The micro detail that haunted observers was the slight tremor in his hand as he lit a stick of incense, a tremor that spoke not only of illness, but of a man shaken by exposure. The midpoint sensory beat revealed the fracture between appearance and reality. Pop ballads from Ayumi Hamasaki played in Tokyo department stores, their optimism clashing with the muttered anger in izakayas, where workers slammed down beer mugs, furious that a gangster had jumped the line for a transplant. The texture of pressed business shirts against sweating backs carried the frustration of citizens working overtime in a stagnant economy while reading about a criminal's survival through privilege. Even in Osaka, the Yamaguchi-gumi's home turf, younger gangsters debated whether Goto had crossed a line too sacred to forgive. By the summer, the scandal had engulfed not only him, but the institutions that enabled it. Politicians dodged questions about whether they had known of his deal. Hospitals in Japan faced new scrutiny for their lack of transplant availability, while American officials endured criticism for granting a visa to a known gangster. Goto, who once prided himself on controlling the narrative, was now caught in one he could not manage. His power status snapshot in 2008 was this: alive, feared, but disgraced, his charisma fractured by headlines that no silk suit or celebrity connection could soften. The consequences rippled through the underworld. Associates withdrew, wary of the taint that clung to his name. Rivals whispered that his decline had begun, not from bullets or police raids, but from exposure in the press. A lieutenant who had once followed him with devotion muttered to a journalist, "He lived too long, and in our world, that is dangerous." Shukan Shinsho, 2008. Law enforcement worldwide, emboldened by the scandal, began to track his networks more aggressively, convinced that his vulnerability offered an opening. As the year closed, the sensory echoes of the scandal lingered. The rustle of newspapers folded on Tokyo subway seats. The bitter scent of coffee in newsroom corners where reporters celebrated their scoop. The soft crackle of radio broadcasts carrying his name into homes across the country. For decades, Goto had controlled his image, transforming himself from delinquent to soldier, from celebrity don to shadow politician. But in 2008, it was not bullets that scarred him, nor rivals that toppled him. It was words in print, headlines that stripped away invincibility and revealed the mortal man beneath. Kobe, 2008. The decision arrived not with a gunshot in the night, nor the wail of sirens, but with a single sheet of paper stamped by the Yamaguchi-gumi headquarters. After decades of loyalty, spectacle, and violence, Tadamasa Goto, the charismatic don who had once ruled Tokyo's nightlife and mingled with celebrities and politicians, was expelled from the very syndicate that had nurtured his rise. The scandal of his liver transplant and the whispers of his dealings with the FBI had left the Yamaguchi leadership with no choice. The syndicate could not afford the stain of his exposure, not at a time when Japanese society was demanding accountability and the state was tightening its grip on organized crime. For Goto, the humiliation was worse than prison. For a Yakuza, being expelled is worse than prison. It is exile, a National Police Agency officer explained bluntly to Kyoto News in 2008. And exile was precisely what awaited a man who had once believed himself untouchable. The sensory atmosphere of Kobe that autumn was muted but heavy. The sound of rain slapping against the tiled roofs of Nada Ward. The faint smoke of mild 7 cigarettes curling from alleyway bars. The smell of salt blowing in from Osaka Bay. All seemed to underscore the silence that followed the announcement. The headquarters of the Yamaguchi-gumi in Yamatadori, was a fortress of stone and glass, its gates guarded, its windows shuttered. Within those walls, the Oyabun's decision had been sealed. Goto's scandals had endangered the syndicate's shield of legitimacy, and the cost of protecting him outweighed the benefits. A headline from Asahi Shimbun that week captured the mood. Yamaguchi Gumi expels notorious boss amid scandal. The public saw a gangster punished. But for insiders, it was the ritual death of a man who had lived by image and power. The mechanics of expulsion were ritualistic. Men who had once bowed to him now delivered notices of separation. His name was struck from syndicate records, his ties ceremonially cut. In Tokyo, whispers rippled through Roppongi and Shinjuku as nightclub owners debated whether to continue payments to his soldiers. In Kobe, junior members of the syndicate understood the lesson clearly. Loyalty mattered, but image mattered more. And any man, even one as feared and admired as Goto, could be cast aside when his scandals jeopardized the whole. A senior associate who had known him for years confided to Shukan Bunshun. He was more dangerous inside than outside by then. His fall was necessary. Yet for Goto himself, the humiliation cut deeper than any police raid. He had cultivated an empire of charisma, presenting himself as both patron and enforcer, celebrity and killer. Now that empire dissolved with a single decree. At a press conference soon after, he announced his retirement, claiming he would dedicate himself to Buddhism. Cameras captured him in monk's robes, his head shaved, his voice even as he spoke of repentance. But the micro-detail betrayed him. Beneath the robes, his wrist bore the glint of a Rolex, the same watch that had marked him as a man of wealth and power for decades. Few believed the performance. Midway through this exile, geography re-anchored his story to Atami, a coastal resort town famed for its hot springs and temples. It was here that Goto retreated, renting a villa and surrounding himself with symbols of renunciation. The sensory environment shifted from neon-lit Tokyo clubs to the quiet drip of water in temple courtyards, the smell of incense replacing the perfume of Ginza hostesses, the soft rustle of monks' robes replacing the tailored suits of Milan. Yet those who visited him reported contradictions. On temple grounds, he bowed deeply, chanting sutras, but his visitors often left in chauffeured cars, deals whispered behind closed doors. A journalist who covered him during this period remarked, "He spoke like a monk, but lived like a don in exile." Mainichi Shimbun, 2009. Law enforcement did not relax its grip. If anything, his expulsion gave them new license to isolate him. A senior NPA investigator explained, "Without the shield of the syndicate, he was vulnerable, but fear still protected him." NPA report, 2009. Indeed, witnesses remained silent, businesses still deferred to his reputation, and rivals hesitated to strike at a man whose charisma still carried weight. His power status snapshot in 2009 was paradoxical. Stripped of his title, yet still commanding influence through reputation, feared but no longer legitimate. One vivid moment during his retreat captured the essence of this contradiction. At a Buddhist ceremony in Atami, reporters noted his voice trembling as he recited chants, the smell of incense thick in the air. Yet behind the temple gates, a row of black sedans idled, engines running, their drivers smoking in silence. The sight suggested that renunciation was a facade, and that the machinery of the Goto Gumi still hummed, even if officially dismantled. Midpoint sensory details reinforced the illusion. The hum of cicadas in Atami's summer heat contrasted with the low rumble of distant trains carrying tourists to the hot springs. The rough texture of wooden prayer beads slipped through Goto's fingers during ceremonies, yet his hands, once steady, now shook with age and illness. The faint smell of cologne lingered in rooms where he met visitors, betraying the persistence of old habits. Even as he claimed to have left the underworld, his presence radiated the contradictions of a man who had lived too long in its shadows to escape. Journalists pursued the story relentlessly. Tabloids questioned whether his retirement was genuine, while serious papers debated what his expulsion meant for the Yamaguchi-gumi. For some, it was proof that Japan's most powerful syndicate had learned to manage its image, sacrificing even its most charismatic figures for survival. For others, it was a hollow gesture, since Goto remained wealthy and shielded. An Asahi Shimbun editorial in 2008 noted, "His expulsion may sever titles, but not influence." In the broader landscape of organized crime, it underscored the Yamaguchi-gumi's pragmatism. They were not beholden to loyalty or myth. They were beholden to survival, and Goto had become too heavy a burden. Among his men, reactions were divided. Some wept at his downfall, remembering the days when he had recruited them with charm and rewarded loyalty with money. Others turned away, understanding that to cling to him meant risking their own futures. One former lieutenant confessed in 2009, "We admired him once, but the syndicate taught us, never worship a man more than the family." Shukan Gendai, 2009. That lesson echoed in every alley where young gangsters debated the meaning of his exile. As years passed, the contradiction of his retirement deepened. He attended temple ceremonies, posed in monk's robes, and spoke of peace. Yet rumors persisted that he still moved money through proxies, that his influence lingered in real estate deals and protection rackets. Law enforcement could never prove it. Rivals hesitated to challenge him directly, wary that even in disgrace his charisma might still summon loyalty. The silence of his exile became as powerful as his voice once had been. By the end of 2008, the sensory echoes of his downfall were clear. The rustle of newspaper pages in Tokyo trains, commuters shaking their heads at headlines that once glorified him. The low drone of Buddhist chants in Atami, carried by the wind into the quiet streets. The faint metallic click of a lighter in his hand, an old habit, breaking the illusion of renunciation. For Tadamasa Goto, expulsion was exile, and exile was a living death. Yet for a man who had once ruled through image, the final irony was that his image endured, fractured but never erased, lingering in the silence between scandal and prayer. Tokyo, 2009. The neon of Shinjuku glared brighter than ever, but one of its most infamous suns had vanished from its streets. Tadamasa Goto, once photographed in tailored suits and chauffeured cars, re-emerged only in carefully staged images, his head shaved, his frame draped in the plain robes of a Buddhist monk. To ordinary citizens flipping through the pages of Shukan Gendai, the transformation was jarring. A gangster once accused of orchestrating murders and brokering political power, now photographed against temple walls, incense curling around his bowed head. Yet the city hummed with doubt. Outside the pachinko parlors where the scent of cheap cigarettes hung in the air and the jangle of coins never ceased, whispers lingered that Goto's retreat was not surrender, but strategy. In Atami, where the sea pressed against the hills and the faint salt smell clung to narrow lanes, he chose to anchor his exile. The retreat town, long favored by Tokyo's elite, became his sanctuary. Locals claimed to see him walking temple courtyards at dawn, wooden prayer beads sliding through fingers once accustomed to the weight of diamond rings. The sensory details painted a stark contrast. The rustle of monks' robes against tatami mats, the soft hum of sutras replacing the heavy bass of Roppongi nightclubs where he once held court. But the illusion cracked in small ways. One visitor later recalled spotting a luxury German sedan parked discreetly near the temple gate, its driver a familiar bodyguard who had once stood behind Goto in Tokyo press photographs. The micro-detail betrayed the reality. The trappings of wealth and power had not been surrendered, only hidden. By 2010, Goto had begun publishing memoirs that sold briskly in convenience stores and bookstores alike. In Habakarinagara, with regret, he cast himself as a man repentant, confessing sins in prose that blurred truth and performance. He wrote of violence, greed, and the emptiness that followed, yet critics wondered how much of it was calculated myth-making. A former associate, interviewed anonymously by Asahi Shimbun in 2010, remarked, "He always knew image was his strongest weapon. This is just another mask." His memoirs were devoured not just by the curious public, but by young gangsters studying them as parables, some reading caution, others reading instruction. Midpoint geography pulled the story back to Atami's hillsides. Here, amid hot springs and ryokan inns, his villa overlooked Sagami Bay. The sensory environment was tranquil. Cicadas droned in the humid summers, temple bells echoed across the valleys, and tourists wandered with the smell of steamed buns and green tea filling the air. Yet inside Goto's retreat, luxury remained. Neighbors reported the faint strains of enka music on expensive speakers, the glint of lacquered furniture glimpsed through sliding doors, and occasional late-night visits from men in dark suits. The contradiction deepened. Was he a monk or a don in exile? A senior police inspector told Yomiuri Shimbun in 2011, "He preached renunciation, but the money never stopped moving. Proxies carried on his business." For Goto himself, the retreat was both mask and mirror. Power status snapshot, publicly stripped, privately wealthy. He understood that his expulsion from the Yamaguchi-gumi meant he could never again command openly. But fear still followed his name. Businessmen still paid silently, and politicians who had once accepted his donations now avoided his gaze, but none dared disown him fully. In one vivid moment recounted by a temple acolyte, Goto stood at the altar, incense curling upward, his voice shaking slightly as he chanted sutras. Yet when the ceremony ended, he stepped outside, lighting a cigarette with a gold-plated lighter. The mingled smell of smoke and incense lingered in the air, a sensory reminder of his contradictions. His memoirs fueled scandal abroad as well. The Los Angeles Times revisited the transplant story with a headline that still echoed in memory. "Gangster receives transplant, citizens left waiting." In Japan, critics accused him of exploiting Buddhism as a shield, while supporters argued he was living proof that even the darkest figures could seek redemption. In the broader landscape of organized crime, his retreat symbolized a generational shift. The Yamaguchi-gumi under Shinobu Tsukasa moved toward discretion, emphasizing financial crime over street violence. Goto, flamboyant and scandal-prone, belonged to an older era where charisma and notoriety built empires. His exile into Atami's shadows was as much about the syndicate's future as it was about his past. Secondary figures orbited him still. His longtime driver, a man named Kawabata, was often seen escorting guests up the steep road to the villa, bowing deeply at the gate before slipping inside. Former lieutenants, meanwhile, moved cautiously in Tokyo, some breaking away to form smaller gangs, others retiring altogether. A rival from another syndicate told Tokyo Sports in 2012, when he disappeared, a whole style of gangster went with him. Flashy, dangerous, untouchable. Now he hides behind sutras. Midway Sensory Beats sharpened this paradox. The echo of a temple bell in a Tommy's evening air carried serenity, but the metallic clink of whiskey glasses inside his villa suggested another life still pulsing. The rough texture of prayer beads in his hand contrasted with the smooth polish of lacquered wood in his study, where manuscripts for his next memoir sat in neat piles. Even the faint smell of imported cigars clung to his robes, carried from visits by men who owed him favors. By the 2010s, Goto's public image had calcified into that of a fallen don cloaked in ritual. Photographs of him in robes circulated online, accompanied by commentary equal parts admiration and scorn. Younger Japanese questioned how a man accused of so much violence could be allowed such a serene retirement. Older observers shook their heads, remembering the days when he had ruled Tokyo's underworld with charm and brutality. For his critics, the retreat was theater. For his admirers, it was proof of survival against all odds. A journalist who had covered him for decades reflected in Tokyo Shimbun, 2013. Whether he chants or schemes, he reminds us that crime in Japan is never erased, only reshaped. That reflection captured the essence of Goto's retreat. He had not vanished. He had only changed form, slipping into the shadows where power lived not in headlines, but in whispers. The closing sensory image returned to the temple. Evening chants rolled like waves across Atami, incense curling skyward in the cooling night. Goto's silhouette, bent in prayer, seemed fragile against the lantern glow. Yet as he rose, the faint jingle of keys in the pocket betrayed him. Not the keys to a temple, but to a luxury car waiting beyond the gate. The sound echoed softly, a reminder that his retreat into shadows was never complete, only concealed. Tokyo, 2010. The city's pulse had changed, but the memory of one man still lingered in alley whispers and newspaper columns. Tadamasa Goto, expelled from the Yamaguchi-gumi and cloaked in the robes of a supposed monk, had retreated into Atami's quiet hills, yet even silence could not erase his shadow. In the smoky corners of Shinjuku's bars, young gangsters clinked glasses of Suntory whiskey and spoke his name with a mix of awe and ambition. Their voices lowered beneath the jukebox hum of Southern all-stars. They remembered him as the man who dared to make politics bend, who crossed oceans for survival, and who reminded them that fear could be worn like a tailored suit. To others, the journalists, the police, the citizens whose lives his empire had scarred, he was proof that corruption had seeped into every level of Japanese life. The smell of cheap Seven Stars cigarettes clung to izakaya walls where his name was invoked, sometimes in admiration, more often in warning. The legacy he left behind was paradoxical, power stripped in public, yet influence still intact in private. The mid-2010s brought a cultural shift in Japan as the government cracked down harder on Yakuza visibility, passing ordinances in prefectures from Tokyo to Okinawa that banned businesses from associating with gangsters. Yet in back rooms, cash continued to slide across tables, and the name Goto remained a currency of its own. In Osaka's Nishinari district, a younger lieutenant allegedly told an undercover reporter from Shukan Bunshun, "Even gone, he sets the standard. Fear and charisma, that's what we measure against." Those words echoed a truth, that for a generation of aspiring bosses, Goto was less man than myth. a reminder that one could command through presence as much as violence. But the myth came at a cost. His transplant scandal, exposed in 2008, continued to ripple into the new decade. In 2011, Mainichi Shimbun revisited the controversy with the blunt headline, "Crime Boss's Surgery Still Casts Long Shadow." For law enforcement, it was a symbol of institutional compromise. For the public, it was evidence that justice in Japan and abroad could be bought. A retired FBI agent told Los Angeles Times in 2012, "He taught us the uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the state makes its own deals with the devil." Midpoint sensory beats sharpened this unease. The rhythmic clatter of subway trains on the Ginza line carried commuters past glowing billboards, yet in their hands they gripped tabloids that still carried Goto's name, as if the past refused to release its grip on the present. Geographically, his reach still stretched from Tokyo's alleys to Atami's sanctuaries. In the hot spring town, tourists swore they saw him, an older man in robes, walking slowly with a cane along the seawall, gulls circling overhead, and the briny air heavy in the dusk. A micro detail surfaced from one witness. The cane, carved with intricate dragons, gleamed with lacquer, a gift too fine for a penitent monk. In Tokyo, meanwhile, photographs of his former lieutenants surfaced in police files. Men now older, balding, some slipping into quieter businesses, others still maintaining discreet ties with construction companies and nightclubs. His influence persisted not through direct command, but through loyalty, reputation, and the lessons he had etched into their bones. Secondary figures preserved his aura. His longtime driver, Kawabata, was seen less frequently, but whenever he appeared near Atami, locals took notice. He was a figure who reminded them that Goto, though retired, was never unprotected. Within the broader Yakuza landscape, the Yamaguchi-gumi fractured into internal wars, splits between the main faction and rival Kobe-based groups in 2015. Analysts noted that Goto's flamboyant style had become unfashionable in an era of corporate-styled bosses, but his legend survived precisely because it contrasted with the new discretion. One journalist wrote in Tokyo Shimbun, 2016, "He embodied a vanishing breed, the gangster who thrived on being seen, who weaponized notoriety." As the decade drew toward its close, health finally overtook reputation. Rumors swirled through Tokyo's underworld in late-night whispers. Goto was frail, his once commanding figure diminished, the liver that had bought him time now a reminder of mortality. In one poignant recollection, a temple attendant told Asahi Shimbun in 2019, he prayed longer each evening, but his eyes wandered, as if still counting debts in silence. His contradictions remained sharp. He was publicly a Buddhist devotee, yet privately still tied to money streams and influence that refused to dry up. Power status. Snapshot. His empire dismantled, his body weakened, but his name still carried more gravity than some active bosses. The turning point arrived in 2022. News broke that Tadamasa Goto had died in Tokyo at the age of 80. Obituaries varied in tone, reflecting the duality that had defined his life. Asahi Shimbun labeled him a charismatic don who blurred lines between crime and politics. The Los Angeles Times was harsher, a ruthless gangster who left scars on Japan. At the announcement, Tokyo's air seemed heavier. In Shibuya Crossing, where neon blazed and thousands hurried through the intersection, young men checked their phones and muttered, while older citizens shook their heads, relieved that an era had closed. Midpoint sound sharpened the image. The chirping pedestrian signal at the crossing, high-pitched and insistent, seemed to mark a passage from one chapter of Japan's underworld to the next. His death was not just personal, it was symbolic. It marked the end of a man whose deal for a liver transplant had exposed the uneasy alliances between organized crime, politics, and foreign institutions. It highlighted how charisma could charm even as violence destroyed, how a gangster could reinvent himself as a monk, yet never shed the scent of smoke and whiskey that clung to his legacy. For younger gangsters, he remained a model of audacity. For law enforcement, a case study in how far corruption could reach. A veteran National Police Agency officer told Kyoto News in 2022, "For a Yakuza, being expelled is worse than prison. For him, death was the final exile." Closing sensory echoes tied his story to its origins. The same incense that once curled in Atami temples now burned in funeral halls, mixing with the faint smell of chrysanthemums as mourners bowed. Outside, the autumn air carried the metallic tang of Tokyo's subways, the hum of life moving forward. Yet in quiet corners of bars, where the jukebox still hummed old enka songs and glasses of whiskey clinked, his name was spoken once more, not as command, but as legend. The liver transplant deal, the scandal that once gave him life, had ultimately taken his throne. It was the reminder that power bought through corruption leaves debts that can never be fully repaid, debts that echo even after the man himself has fallen into silence.